Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Matt.
I'm Dean.
Usually each episode is either just Dean and I talking, or we're lucky enough to interview somebody else through Skype or whatever. This week, Dean got a really cool opportunity to interview Lambert Zuidervaart, who's a professor from the Institute of Christian Studies, or he just retired. Because it was sort of like a unique opportunity, Dean interviewed him in person without me, and that's cool, but that poses some like technical problems for us or whatever. So this podcast is made up of clips from this interview and then like some other side discussions between Dean and I. Dean, can you introduce who Lambert is and why he's important?
Yeah, sure. So Lambert Zuidervaart, like you just said, was a prof at the Institute for Christian Studies, which is where I go. I did my master's there, and I'm doing my PhD there now. And he's a really interesting character, not just because he was my professor. He was one of the first people to really write serious secondary commentary on Theodor Adorno in English, a German critical theorist, really interesting character. And then Lambert has since kind of continued to work in critical theory. And he's an interesting character because he does it as a Christian, and sometimes his work is sort of explicitly motivated in that way, and then other times he's sort of just doing more systematic philosophical work. So in the interview, I thought it would be interesting to maybe get him to tease some of those things out for us, for Christians thinking about what it means to be on the left today, because he spent a long time thinking really carefully and at a really high level about what that means. So instead of introducing Lambert and his background, I figured maybe we'll just take this as an opportunity to let him do that himself.
So yeah, I grew up, without knowing much about what I'll just call the Reformational movement. I grew up as part of a Dutch immigrant culture in Northern California. Member of the Christian Reformed Church all my life until much later. Went to these schools that were part of the movement. Then went to college. Graduate school, got my degree from the Free University. All of that was in the context of a kind of Dutch Calvinist upbringing. But once I went to Berlin and was exposed to a very, very different religious culture and a very, very different kind of left politics. I mean, you talk about Marxists and anarchists. I mean, they were there and they were serious, right? They would disrupt classes. They were, it wasn't just armchair politics. But anyway, that sort of opened my eyes to a much bigger world, a much bigger sense of what the issues are.
So that's Lambert Zuidervaart, and we'll learn a bit more about him as we go here, but I want to start off talking a little bit about his response to a question I asked sort of in the beginning of the interview. So I was curious to hear what he would have to say about not just the situation of, Donald Trump and presidents and politics or whatever in the United States, but specifically about what should we do in light of the fact that, the Democrats failed to prevent this, and there's all this kind of energy happening, but it's not totally clear. And this is what he had to say.
I work at the level of generality for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. So I have very little to advise about specific measures to take. But I could say something in a general way that would be relevant to the more particular actions that people need to take. I think at this point, at least in American society, the real alternatives are to be found not in formal politics, but in what I call civil society. So in all these organizations and movements and so on that are, up in arms, resisting, protesting, organizing, that's where the movement towards a new politics can emerge. And it will take years and years for that to take shape in a formal politics. I mean, these dominant political parties have been entrenched for so long that it would take a long time for them to become unentrenched, but it will happen eventually. But for it to happen, there has to be this surge, continual surge from civil society towards something different, which I think has to involve a primacy given to concerns of ecology, a primacy given to concerns about, well, I'll say income inequality, but it's bigger than that. Concerns about an economy which, in order to operate, has to continually channel public goods, collective goods, into the pockets of people who are already wealthy. So it's a systemic problem. It's not just a matter of making a few adjustments in the tax code or something like that. So those two things, at least, an ecological concern and a concern about the very structure of capitalism. I think those have to be at the center of a new politics, which I think has to emerge out of the informal political sphere and finally come to shape in a more formal way.
All right, Matt. So listening to a little bit of Lambert's answer to that question, what do we do? He says that it doesn't come from formal politics. He thinks that it comes from civil society. And he says it's going to take a really long time as a result because the alternatives are, they have to sort of build and grow. What do you make of that?
On the one hand, I'm not surprised at all. Formal politics so far is, I don't know, not doing much in the ways of democracy or like social good. So that the options aren't there. Like electing the right person isn't going to do it for us, I guess. Sorry, future Democratic nominees, I guess, whatever. But that it comes from protest, from organization, that it won't happen until it sort of grows is, what I already know to be true, but also terrifying and kind of annoying, because like I want to seize the means of production now. I don't want to wait.
For our lives to be over.
Yeah,
you want to know right now what will it be?
That's exactly right.
That makes sense to me. I also have a similar sort of concern, and it's funny because I've brought this up with Lambert before. In other contexts, being a student. And we'll kind of get into more of this later with the difference between reformism and revolution, which we talk about a little bit. But here, I just thought it was interesting because he says rightly, I think, that at the center of this new politics has to be ecology and the structure of capitalism, which I think is exactly right. But I'm also not sure how to do that. And there's kind of an interesting naive sort of faith, naive positively stated, kind of faith in regular people that Lambert has, that, maybe they'll just figure it out. And that kind of reminded me a lot of what we were talking about with respect to Virilio in the last episode, where Virilio also was like, well, if you just go hang out with like regular people, they're not so bad. And that's sort of where his hope springs. And there's something going on here with Lambert too that seems similar to that, but I have to admit that, I don't know, if I'm being really honest with myself, it's hard for me to trust the people without some kind of like revolutionary organ, like a party or something.
Yeah, I agree with you. It is hard. It is hard, and that connection to Virilio is right on. That it's just like about like real people. Again, like sort of an appeal to the mass, an appeal to the common person is actually like a nice Christian-y place to start, probably. So here's a confession. A weird confession, I guess. So I live in Southern Illinois. That's, I think everyone knows. Maybe not. I don't know. Southern Illinois is a very bad place to be a leftist because there's nothing going on down here. It's like our I don't know, the representative down here is like a libertarian or something, and it's all very bad. Anyways, here's my confession that relates to this conversation. This one guy on Facebook messaged me a few days ago and is really, really interested in starting a Democratic Socialists of America chapter in Southern Illinois.
Nice.
And I guess we're gonna do it. So I signed up on. So I mean, I've been like a dues paying member for like a hot minute since the election. But then I signed up on the old DSA website to like get on like the conference call or whatever you do to start a local chapter. And I don't know. I mean, I remember when we talked to Derek about parties and the importance of discipline and stuff. I think I'm like on board with the whole PSL train, but there's a really stupid, like, I guess, reason that I think DSA is a better option for people in Southern Illinois, probably because it's just more accessible. And
yeah,
but there's also like a lot of social momentum behind it at the moment, which is not everything like at all. It's not like a good ideology. It's not a good platform, whatever. It's just like momentum. Anyways, so I think kind of reflecting on like that thing going on in my life in the one hand, and then the thing that Lambert's talking about. Yeah, I think that's right. Like we have to find these ways forward of growing movements of re-understanding the world through different frameworks, and I guess it takes some time and some building and I don't know, a lot of hard work.
Yeah, I think the DSA is probably something to point to. Lambert didn't strictly mention them in our interview, but it seems like that's the kind of thing that he's after. It reminds me of something Cornel West said in like an op-ed, and I think The Guardian or something a while back, about how the Democratic Party isn't doing anything and we should start like a People's Party, which I thought was kind of weird because there already are alternative parties in the United States. Yeah. But, I mean, he's involved in the DSA, and he's clearly trying to stoke those sort of fires, and I think Lambert's, interested in that as well. I don't know. It's a weird thing. The DSA is strange like that because it is a sort of institution of civil society in a certain sense. It's not a political party.
Yeah, it's not like the PSL. It's a different sort of situation.
Yeah, and I don't know. It would be interesting to hear what Lambert would think about the DSA. I should have asked him next time. He can write in. He can be like, "You got me wrong. I don't support them at all. I've joined the PSL since our interview."
He's going in the mountains. He's got an AK-47. He's like ready. There's like, man, and there's also just like a real type of cynicism, I guess, in me at this point about the, like, DSA as an organization, but I think about any type of like leftist organization where it's like, really, is that what you think is gonna like do this? Is that really what's gonna get you there? And like, I don't know, probably not, but like you got to do something naively, just throwing yourself out there. Speaking of cynicism and just trying to like throw yourself out there into whatever like revolutionary efforts you find that are available, whether it's the DSA or the PSL or whatever. Some of like that cynicism probably just comes from like not knowing what to do or not having adequate ways to understand the world still. So like Marx is great. I'm like way in on that. And there's all kinds
thumbs
of thumbs up emoji, 100% fire. But like and there's like, plenty of like people still doing Marxist theory. Like, I mean, Derek, of course, who I'll keep mentioning forever because he's great. But like, I don't know, Franco Berardi and Mark Fisher, like those kind of guys, they're always critiquing capitalism further, like describing, critiquing, trying to figure out how to kind of get through this. But that reminds me of something else that you and Lambert were talking about in this interview. Lambert has this kind of like great quotable line. He just says, "Revolution isn't what it used to be." So, like, no kidding, I guess. So anyways, let's play that chunk and we can talk about it.
Well, revolution isn't what it used to be.
That's true.
I mean, that was what the Frankfurt School was wrestling with in the 20s and 30s already. Like, once you have, and this is, after the imperialist war of the First World War, once you have a capitalist economy as sophisticated and complicated and interwoven with the academy, interwoven with people's ordinary lives, heavy consumption and so on and so forth, it's not the kind of economy you can just overthrow.
So if revolution isn't what it used to be, and I guess like you don't just overthrow a capitalist economy that's this ingrained into everyday life and into consumption and production, I don't know. How do we talk about revolution? How do we talk about these like central sort of like leftist Marxist ideas of overcoming capitalism? What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard. I've always had a hard time actually having these conversations at a place like ICS because it is so infused with critical theory for the better. I mean, it's really cool that it's a Christian institution thinking about people like Adorno and Horkheimer and Habermas, etc. But, the majority of profs here are definitely leftists, sometimes depressively so, sometimes optimistically so, but they're not revolutionary thinkers. And, I don't know. I feel very ambivalent about it. It's like, I think Lambert is absolutely right that capitalism is so ingrained in just daily consciousness that even if you did like change the mode of production tomorrow or something, which obviously nobody thinks is possible, but even if you did, it would take a long time to make the kinds of real, sustainable, deep changes that you would have to make in order to rebuild a society that isn't based on, competition and consumption and like massive, just like waste of resources. So yeah, I don't know. I just feel very unsettled by it really, because I think that there's a part of me that feels like Lambert's sort of right about it, but I don't want him to be.
Yeah, for sure. So I did my master's degree at the University of Illinois with this guy named Richard Gilman-Opolsky, and he's a real cool guy. He's like he's a political scientist, political philosopher, and like exclusively does like anarchist, Marxist, autonomous stuff. And I don't know, the time that I spent like working with him, I feel like I've read enough sort of like theories of revolution and diagnoses of capitalism to last a lifetime in like the best possible way. Like I'm like full to the brim with like that. And I think what's really hard, I mean, the revolution isn't what it used to be because capitalism isn't what it used to be, because like
yeah, that's right.
I mean, we don't live in a world of even like Taylorism anymore. It's like it's post that. What I find helpful though is all of the contemporary Marxists and anarchists and like I don't know, whoever else is out there like still taking the time to like really try to understand like the capitalist political economy with some amount of rigor along the same lines of Marx, with the same type of like revolutionary fervor and desire. I guess like I don't know. I always think of people like Franco Berardi or Mark Fisher, like those types of guys, I think are really good at describing this like sort of strange hyper capitalistic mode of political economy, and I think they offer like in describing like what it's like to live and work in these types of like settings, they do us all a service, and they kind of demonstrate like what needs to be contested or what needs to change. One particularly hot take that always sticks with me on these points about like revolution and also capitalism is the way that like capitalist labor expands like in any direction, like it has like like whatever room it like has to grow, it will just like it'll grow into that room. The blob, like those like crazy toys and you get when you're a kid that you add water to and it just like expands and gets bigger, like the dinosaurs that you great.
I've heard of them. Whatever.
I'm familiar with the dinosaurs. Yes. So Berardi has this really interesting like description of like cognitive labor, and the way that like sort of like the like digital technology fractalizes labor time into so many chunks, so that like you don't work an 8-hour day anymore. You work like a 24-hour day, and you just like don't realize it.
Yeah, because your boss is like texting you or like talking to you on Slack or whatever, and it's not like really work, but it actually is. Yeah,
that's right. You're always on call. It's like I had some students I was kind of explaining this to. They did this project, and they were talking about like this, like the stress levels students feel or whatever. And I was explaining to them like a good professor does, like the like theory of alienation and labor. And I was trying to explain like how it's even worse now because you're never not at work, so you're like never really at home in your own body. You're always kind of deferring that or whatever. So if that's the case, like if these like I don't know, if capitalism looks different than it did with Marx, then like revolution inevitably will have to as well, right? Like I think that organizing people is very good, but I don't know. It just it makes you think that it'll take on different forms.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting as a way to get into why I think Lambert is so cool as a thinker, because in a lot of ways he also recognizes, like he says, the revolution isn't what it used to be, or revolution in general isn't what it used to be. And as a result, like critiquing capitalism isn't what it used to be, like you're saying. And as a result, he's developed a whole weird vocabulary, weird in a positive sense. Like it's very unique to Lambert. And it's cool. So instead of talking about, revolution qua revolution. He prefers to talk about a transformational change, which is like a very technical term. But he has this whole kind of web of really useful ways of naming, like you were saying with respect to Berardi, what it's like to live under global capitalism. I asked him about one of those things, actually. Maybe we could play that clip about societal evil in particular, which sounds like a very basic term, and kind of it is, but it's also just ominous enough to be super cool, and like a really cool way of articulating at least how I feel under
so the notion of
capitalism.
societal evil is one that I've developed in order to get at the kind of problem that Adorno and Horkheimer were addressing in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and that Adorno continued to struggle with right through the 50s and 60s until he died in 1969. So he agonized about how to do philosophy after Auschwitz. He agonized about whether we can write poetry after Auschwitz. After Auschwitz becomes a kind of a moniker for the situation in which he thinks, society and culture in general in the West finds itself. Auschwitz is a very, very difficult, the Holocaust is a very, very difficult, large-scale atrocity to understand. How could it occur? Why did people do it? And who do you hold responsible for it? And how, right? It's all, in order to account for something at that level, you have to be able to talk about how certain patterns of conduct and attitude and disposition, behavior, come together, entrench themselves in a society, in what I call cultural practices and social institutions, and become so enmeshed in the very fabric of the society that's A, hard to recognize, B, hard for anybody to take responsibility for it, because it's basically like the air we breathe, and C, for anybody to resist it. And that's what I'm trying to get at. And so, for me, the kind of patterns that we have in place with respect to so-called environment, to our biosphere, is a manifestation of societal evil. It's such an deeply entrenched set of patterns. It's extremely difficult to recognize, to take responsibility for, and then to effectively resist. Same thing with the economy. The disparities in the economy between those who have and those who have not, and the way that the economy depends on that disparity, is so entrenched. It's very hard for anybody to take any kind of personal or even collective responsibility for it. But somebody's got to be responsible for it, right? Otherwise, it's just a fate that we live with, and we have to throw up our hands.
Yeah, so societal evil is interesting to me because it just pulls together a lot of ways in which I think average people actually feel, not even just leftists, but just normal, everyday people. Like, I don't know, maybe it's a generational thing or some contingency, but even when I grew up, I didn't grow up in a community of leftists. I grew up in like rural Michigan, and people still talked about how weird it is that if you take out a piece of clothing from your closet, it says that it was like made in, I don't know, Bangladesh or something. And like, that's like for 1 second, you're like, oh no, that's very bad. But then you don't care. But it flashes across your brain for like a quick minute throughout your life. And I think, yeah, I don't know. The more you think about it, the more debilitating it gets. At least that's my basic history in my own sort of coming to revolutionary consciousness is like, oh my gosh, not only is, my clothes, not only are they made by like slaves on the other side of the world, but also like everybody's a slave and everything is very bad. And I'm still like buying garbage at garbage stores from garbage people so I can like keep turning other people into garbage. Like that's very unfortunate and sad. And it just like crushes any sort of will to live. So I appreciate that Lambert actually names that phenomenon such that you could hopefully bounce up against it and think it through in some sort of way.
Yeah, I don't know as much about Lambert as you do, obviously. But when I heard that part, I thought that it really spoke to like the question of violence we're always pressing right up against in these episodes. Like last week I made the joke that like every single week we talk about Paul Virilio, but also every single week we talk about violence and like
Yeah, that's true.
like rap air horn noise. This is the violence part of this episode. But societal evil seems like it describes that though. You know, like that overarching like violence that communists and whoever should fight against and should resist.
Yeah, that's right.
But calling it societal evil is probably a better branding move than just calling it like confusing, like a sort of confusing description of violence, because violence is already so co-opted by liberalism and everything else. So just calling calling it societal evil is helpful to me to just understand those like large patterns of oppression in which like we don't normally think about because they're normalized by hegemonic powers and whatever.
Yeah, I think you're saying that it's a good branding move is also helpful because it is easy to get people on board with, like average people on board with fighting actual evil or whatever, if you can name it, even if you think that you're beyond good and evil or whatever, like most people don't. So it's kind of a good thing to pitch the idea in those terms instead of fighting the violence inherent in the system or something.
Right. It's a kind of nice step that like I get like the sort of like the language of like that large scale violence. Like I think that makes sense and I think it's right. I just think the word violence is so like laden with stupid, unthoughtful meaning that calling it societal evil kind of sidesteps that obfuscation that is already there. So yeah, I don't know. From now on, I'll just say, yeah, but societal evil, man. I'll be like, yeah, good point.
Yeah, it's nice too because it actually puts the polemic in a polemical way. You know what I mean? So the trouble with saying there's the trouble with saying there's structural violence or whatever is like we asked both Derek and Vincent this question about, okay, yeah, that's true, but like what about violence? Like people hurting other people or like blowing up stuff or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
And it just like bogs you down in these weird conceptual hair splitting matches that are, I don't know, they just distract from what's really at stake. And just putting it in terms of like, yep, good versus evil. This is evil. It's gotta go. That's very helpful.
Yeah. I'm also, I'm wondering right now if like that's an oversimplification of the problem, and like probably, but I still think it's good. I don't know. I'm sure that like I'm sure that there are problems with what we're saying, but I think that it's I don't know. Right now, in this moment, it is helpful to me to understand like the overarching structural violence of things.
Yeah. I think too, one thing that's really great about Lambert is by virtue of thinking these things through in his own unique vocabulary, he's also trying to just provide some concepts that people could not just use and take on board. I mean, in some cases that works and it helps. Like here, it's a contextual aid or something. But he's also just trying to invite a discourse, I think, about these kinds of issues. And what's great about him is it's not like he just sort of is like one and done. Here's what it is. It's societal evil. The end. Like he's trying to articulate something in his articles and books that you could take up and disagree with productively or agree with productively.
Yeah.
And inaugurating that kind of conversation on the left. He even talks about that with respect to reformism and revolution. I think that's a really good thing. So yeah, he's inviting this conversation on the left, and I think what I really appreciate about Lambert is that he's doing that as a Christian person, and he doesn't feel a kind of anxiety to name the fact that he's a Christian in every one of those invitations. But if you ask him about it, it's there. So that's what I did. I asked him about it. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how his Christianity helps him intervene in these kind of leftist conversations, and we could play a little bit of that.
So there are two very fundamental, I'll call them theological. I don't usually talk the language of theology. But there are two theological convictions that sustain all my social philosophy. One is that, in principle, the creation is good. Or to put it more theologically, God created the heavens and the earth and declared them good. So that's really a very strong theological conviction. And the other one is that where history is headed in the long term is toward what's called the new heaven and the new earth. That for me is not pie in the sky, in the sweet by and by. that is really a vision of a new society. And I think that's also the case in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what the language I used in my talk last night was the messianic condition. That there's a really strong sense in the chronologically later writings in Scripture that everything is headed towards a messianic condition when the wolf and the lamb lie down together, right? Well, that for me means part of the task of a Christian social philosopher is to try to envision what a new earth would be like, given current conditions, given the kind of society we're in right now. What would a new earth look like if we could move from where we're at right now to something that is better for everything, for everyone and everything? What would that look like? Well, for clues about that, of course, I'm going to pay attention to what philosophers and political theorists and economists and so on and so forth have said about what makes for human flourishing and creational flourishing. But I'm also going to take very, very seriously what I can find in the scriptures of the Hebrew and Christian traditions. And there, my talking about justice and solidarity and resourcefulness, that all comes out of scriptural sources, even though I don't indicate that all the time.
Yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. A lot of what he says in that snippet is really interesting. That's probably one of my favorite parts of the interview, and we can talk about a few things there. So 2 things that I think are very good. One is a thing that you tweeted out a little while ago after listening to it, that Lambert says the task of the Christian social philosopher is to imagine what a new heaven and a new earth would be like given current conditions, and how we get there. Like, that's a really cool sort of rallying cry, I guess. It beats like whatever Alvin Plantinga is talking about, like what Christian philosophers should do or say or whatever. Like, this is a very, very improved version of that kind of thing. And then the second thing I thought was really neat was at the end of that clip, he talks a little bit about, how he's deriving a lot of his notions about things like justice, solidarity, resourcefulness from the scriptures, but he doesn't always say that. So those 2 things I think are really cool. It's like the task of the Christian philosopher to do this is to do this. But then also, sometimes it's strategically useful not to just like throw that out there or whatever, and be a little more inclusive of other people on the left.
Yeah, I think just like the formation of the statement is actually inclusive, or I don't know. It just makes me think of the Zapatistas, like that. Basically, like what he's saying is like another world is possible, and the role of like the Christian social philosopher is to like think about that other possible world. That's. I don't know. It's a great thing to say, and I think it's very true. What sticks out to me in that like clip too is that so it is like sort of this like forward thinking, like what does it look like kind of thing. That's good. Like, what does a just society look like and all that kind of stuff. But also like he makes it pretty explicit that like what does it look like, and like what does it look like in terms of like current conditions as well. It's like not detached. It's not detached from like the real existing material relationships of like capitalist hell that we live in or whatever. So that's very good as well.
Yeah, I think so too. And it makes me think a lot about some of the stuff that we have been trying to explore just tangentially on this podcast. Like, we talked about it with Derek explicitly by basically saying, hey, Derek, you're not a Christian. Why should Christians join your party? And then we talked about it a little more in a different context with Vincent, where we said something like, Vincent, you're trying to pitch prison abolition as a religious problem to people who aren't religious. How are you doing that? And I think Lambert's trying to do that too, like build these sort of bridges between Christian vocabularies and leftist vocabularies, and not seeing them as like necessarily antithetical, because they don't have to be. I think that's just like a really powerful thing for Christians looking for how to get involved in the left. Like, it gets rid of some of those anxieties about like whether or not you're being fully Christian enough, or even like fully leftist enough.
So it's really cool to make those connections, between leftists and Christians and whatnot. I guess my biggest difficulty is that I see like the desire to think about like a positive and hopeful future more with leftists than I do with Christians.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, on the one hand, that's not surprising. I mean, like, Marxism in general is like, I mean, it's necessarily thinking about the future. It's necessarily thinking about like what like a really good society looks like. And Christianity is more about like this like vague good thing that will happen, like a redemption of people, but never talking about explicitly how. And I don't know. I guess like overall, like leftist theories of like what actually good societies look like and like what they do help answer the eschatological like questions, or help kind of fill in the blanks of like what Christian eschatology should be about, and how it maybe should play out. But I don't see like a lot of Christians, I guess, like stepping up and like really thinking about that, thinking about the future in like any really like explicit terms. And that's concerning to me. I don't know. So this is like kind of a really bizarre tangent, but two different groups of Christians that I find really interesting are sorry, Dean, this is weird. Christian trans.
I'll go there. I'm following you.
Yeah, you have to. This is it. This is all you've got. Like Christian transhumanists and Mormon transhumanists. They're like the weirdest possible like cacophony of different like ideas that you don't think should fit together, but like can. And like they're interesting because they're like people who are explicitly religious and are using that religious language to think about like weird futuristic and like mostly science fiction-y type things. And even though it is kind of like off the wall and sometimes like bizarre, at least it's like thinking about the future in a very explicit way, and it's not just like, well, I don't know, Jesus will come back and it'll be great or whatever. Pie in the sky, you know, it's like, it's actually like a thing. I don't know. Is that experience at all like yours?
Yeah, totally. Though I think, okay, so yes, having especially gone to like an evangelical undergraduate school, etc., more often than not in those contexts, eschatology is the kind of thing that intentionally persuades you away from material change and revolutionary activity. So yeah, that's very bad. But at the same time, like, I'm just thinking a little bit about, in many other parts of the world outside of North America, religious language is the very thing that the left uses to really latch on, or vice versa. Like, religious individuals find themselves attracted to leftist discourses precisely because of their religious vocabularies. So, like, liberation theology is the most obvious example. In Latin America, like, there's a great comment from Michael Lowy in one of his books where he says that, like, if leftists want to do anything in Latin America, it's not going to happen without Christians. So you better find a way to, like, talk to them as Christians. And he's not a Christian himself. It's just like he gets that that's a translation that has to happen. And there are liberation theologians that are trying to do that. I think what I love about Lambert is that he's a North American Calvinist, trying to find ways to have these kind of leftist conversations coming out directly of a kind of Calvinist philosophical worldview, which is so unexpected, like very, very surprising.
Yeah, that's true, I guess. I think that you're right. Still, I guess my concern is that, like, the ways we think about the future, like, specifically are important because they shape what we think is, like, possible now. There's, like, a type of, like, cultural imagination sort of thing, I guess I'm thinking about. And that that Christians don't think directly about material change, or that, like, or that all Christians aren't like Paul Virilio and thinking about like what automation will do to employment or something. Like, that's not like a Christian justice issue at this point. Right. To me, is like just like a failure of like misunderstanding the immediate future that's kind of coming, and that if we don't have some like Christian ideas or some like ways of handling those situations as a faithful people now, when we can't think through those like sort of, I don't know, distant but like oncoming technological and social issues, we will be at a loss for like when they happen.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I see what you mean now, and I think that's absolutely right. I guess the question is like, I mean, how do you get Christians to do that? Because in my experience, it doesn't work to be like, you should read Karl Marx, because they're like already poisoned against him, right? So yeah, I don't know. I mean, one strategy that a place like ICS, the Institute for Christian Studies, has found is to just repurpose these traditions in ways that are more liberating. And, you know, from their experience, they're like, actually, it's not that hard. If you just like work really hard at reading the Bible, or like work really hard at thinking through sort of the radical implications of certain theological impulses, you might get there.
Yeah.
I think that's cool. Like Lambert identifies two of those, right? That all creation is good. And then also like, so that's the front end. Like at the very beginning, it was good. And then at the very end, it'll also be good. And it's true that there's a sort of, they could be understood as like vague platitudes. But they manifest a really robust kind of social theory in his case, that I think is, I don't know, sort of a cool like model for Christian scholarship.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Getting starting like a capital reading group at your church probably isn't the way to go.
I mean, if they would, that would be a great way to go.
Right, but they're not. But like, I don't know, don't read Marx, read like the parable of the workers in the field or whatever. Like, it doesn't matter what time you show up for work, you just get paid the same amount as everybody else. That's the parable where Jesus introduces a universal basic income.
Well, I wonder what you would make, sort of given all this, about what Lambert says specifically about a Christian left. So I kind of pitched in this question about, do you think that there's a Christian left, or do you think that there's a relationship between Christians and the left? And I don't know, I thought that was really interesting what he said, and maybe it would help us out a little bit here.
I don't think there's a Christian left. I think there have been many different ways in which Christians have found themselves aligning with forces on the left.
Okay, so Lambert doesn't think there's like a Christian left, which is devastating for our brand. But
is it?
I don't know, maybe not. It's probably okay. So there's no Christian left, but there are leftists, there are Christians who ally themselves with leftists. I don't know, Dean, what do you think?
Yeah, that is very much my jam. Of all the complications that I have with Lambert, I think that's one that I just feel pretty at home with. I don't know. This could be conditioned by the fact that I like really don't like when Christians get too worried about like being Christians. In this, like, it becomes this kind of identity qualifier. And I don't know, I was thinking about like the Tradnista movement and like the Tradcaths on the left. And they're like so obsessed with being Catholic to the exclusion of their leftist commitments sometimes. So that's kind of the specter that I have. And I don't know, I guess I just feel like historically, like the worker priests in France, for example, they were priests, but they just joined communist and anarchist parties. They didn't like start a like Christian leftist party or something. They were Christians who participated in leftist parties. So I don't know. That kind of like speaks to me, I guess. But I don't know. What do you think?
All right. So first, I'm on board. Usually with anything that will thwart the trads, I will undercut them
good.
At any
We're
point.
We're on the same side still.
Yes, good. Nah, that's okay. But I guess I'm hesitant when people talk about or want to talk about Christianity as if it were like a monolithic thing, and I don't know. That seems difficult to me because it's such a giant thing.
Yeah.
If ever there were an appropriate time to use the very specific terminology hyperobject, I would probably use it right here. Like, it's difficult to talk about Christianity in any encompassing or exhaustive way. There's just like a lot going on, sort of like through time and space. There's like so many different expressions of it. I'm not in that. I'm not trying to like to disqualify anybody as Christian. I guess I'm just trying to like I don't know. How do you say that like people are Christian while there are so many diverse practices of that type of Christianity? To me, like there are blank spaces that are left in Christianity. Like I was saying a few minutes ago that there's like a blank space in terms of like eschatology in Christianity. And the Christian left part of that is like how we fill in those blank spaces. So I don't know. I don't feel like there's a lot writing on this whole thing for me, actually, but I feel like it's kind of like a helpful description in some ways. Maybe like a shorthand description, not like any like really impactful and meaningful label, but helpful for sorting things out, I guess, for me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you for sure. And I would guess that Lambert would also agree with you. I mean, he was responding to the way in which I framed the question, which was basically like, is there a Christian left or not? And he was like, well, no. There are Christians who sometimes end up on the left, you know. Which I think is sort of a way of avoiding the kind of problem that you're articulating here, that no, there's not a Christian left. It's not like, oh, there's this one big thing where all the Christians are on the left in this way or that other way.
Right.
And I think he's trying to sidestep that exactly by saying, like, no, there are just Christians who end up in leftist stuff, and, like, that's it.
That makes sense, I guess. So I think it happens, I mean, like, is there a Christian left seems like such an esoteric question to begin with. Like, I think the better...
It's a Twitter problem. It is no other problem.
Yeah. Oh, because I think the more relevant question is, like, is there a Christian right? Because, like, I mean, like, I'm working at a Methodist and evangelical school, and like It seems like there is a Christian right insofar as like in terms of racial injustice and stuff. There's a comment I've heard on my campus that drives me insane. And I'm thinking about it, and I'm like very mad right now about it. Anyways, this guy, I just remember this guy. It doesn't matter who he is, but he said, in terms of racial injustice, said like, it's not a race problem; it's just like a sin problem. And like, that's like the Christian right take on that kind of thing, where it's like, well, Christians will just identify material injustice and racial injustice in terms of like sin, and that makes me feel very uncomfortable because it takes some of like the power away from it and like the imagination away from it. So identifying as Christian left or thinking of that as a helpful description, I guess seems worthwhile to me because it adds to Christianity like what is not there.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So, like, is there a Christian left in the same way that there's a Christian right, which is kind of a loose hodgepodge coalition that nevertheless, like, coalesces around certain social issues? Is that kind of what you're, like, getting at?
Yeah, I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, no, that makes sense to me. Again, like, I don't know. I can't really speak for Lambert. I wish that we interviewed him together. That's what I wish. But, I would suspect he would probably agree with that too. I mean, you know, he's a Christian who has spent basically his whole life trying to explain to other people, Christians and otherwise, why they should be on the left.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he, like, actually goes to church and stuff. So, you know, if there's a Christian left, he's part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
But maybe we could talk about how this feeds into his own worries about, like, identity politics, because that's sort of where my worry stems from.
Yeah.
Like, there is a weird Christian identity politics where it just comes down to, hey, are we being Christian enough about this, or are Christians getting represented in the left enough on this? And in a weird way, like, I think Jacques Ellul is exactly that problem, right? Where it's like... yeah, I'm an anarchist because I'm a Christian. I'm not an anarchist because, like, I don't know, I think, like, I care about the workers. And then all of his anarchism gets sort of sidelined by whether or not it measures up to his, like, weird biblical hermeneutic or something.
Yeah, that's totally right. Jacques Ellul definitely falls into that trap. I think that's something worth noting. I don't know, that type of like identity politics in terms of Christianity just seems so inauthentic, and like, what's the point? Yeah, I guess that's like my one. That's my concluding thoughts always about Ellul after revisiting him. Just what's the point? I don't know. Like, I want my cows to play with other cows and also be happy and like and healthy. So whatever.
Vaccinated.
Yeah, that's right. I don't want them to have to be on the hill. I want them to go play in the field, not on the hill, you know?
Yeah, I get it.
So like, what's the point of just like keeping them there for some type of weird purity thing? So Lambert brings up Ellul again in the conversation in more of like a funny, playful way. So
yeah, that's right.
I think that kind of gets to a good kind of concluding part with his remarks about politics, at least. So let's play that.
So I guess it was Jacques Ellul who said, think globally and act locally. And I think that's still good advice. I think it's really important to get involved in something local which you can see is making a difference, but also is aligning in a helpful way with larger patterns beyond the local scene, whatever that means, whether it be in community agriculture or whether that be social work, whatever. Because then that gives you a way to contribute in a very specific locale to some kind of change. So that's part of it. But I think the acting locally needs to also be done for the sake of what's global. In other words, it's easy to just get caught up in activism and just do what needs to be done because the tasks are right in front of you. They're so obvious. But especially people who are intellectuals or cultural leaders of one sort. I think it's if their local involvement has to still have a more global horizon to it, and that's tricky. And I think I kept reminding myself when I was involved in the Urban Institute of Contemporary Arts. This is one institution in one city, but what we're doing here could have significance beyond it, and we need to keep that in mind, for better or worse.
So think globally, act locally, right? It's like so Jacques Ellul says it, but I think it's pretty common in the vernacular when we talk about politics. People say that all the time. It's kind of a slogan for, I don't know, everybody, like vaguely.
That's right.
And I think that Lambert's articulation of it is actually very good and better than like what most people kind of put up. But it makes me think of, I don't know, sort of like a slogan on the left for a second, like last year and the year before. I think it was Nick Cernick, the guy that wrote Inventing the Future, the accelerationist guy. I think that he said it. But anyways, the quote is this, that Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens.
Right.
So I think that so that critique that Cernick says in kind of like in that funny way, he says it in that funny way, it gets at a type of local politics that is too easy for some people, I think, to fall into. That like you only do things like if we can make one space of resistance, then we've done something or whatever, and it never kind of gets beyond like your backyard where you have a garden that you give carrots away to your neighbor or something. Nick Cernick critiques that with this Goldman Sachs kind of joke, but he makes this like larger point where you can't just act locally. It has to have this like larger global connection. And I think Lambert kind of gets that too. And makes it clear that like, you do something locally that connects to like a larger ethos or a larger movement. And I don't know, that's helpful. That's a good thing to say. A good twist on like that often, I don't know, a detrimental quote.
Yeah, I think too, I don't know, it's like you have to do something. And you can't help but act locally, or at least I can't. Like, I can't really afford to like take a plane and act in a variety of other places. So in that sense, I like what Lambert says, where it's very dialectical. It's like you act locally in such a way that you're hopefully affirming what's happening in your community in a helpful way, but you're also doing that in such a way that hopefully connects to a larger, broader change, and that fits with Lambert's general sort of program or whatever. But what's cool is like Lambert has done that in his own life. Like he was the president of this thing called the Urban Institute for Contemporary Arts in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is still there. And they had to build a whole new building, and he was like really intentional about thinking about gentrification and those kinds of problems. And it was like a very local thing, like a local institute for contemporary art, which is very bougie. But then also it was like, well, okay, if we're going to do this, like, how can we do this? How can we build a building in a way that might hopefully like help this city out in a certain sense? And, like probably it has like failed on a variety of fronts, and probably it has succeeded on other fronts, but it's important to sort of think about those kinds of, small scale acts in one city that contribute to like a very broad transformation, hopefully in like global patterns. Like, I don't know, I guess that fits with kind of what he talked about earlier with reform and revolution. You know, it'll take hundreds of years, it'll come from civil society. Like, this is one way of doing that.
Yeah, I think that you're right. That makes sense. Well, I guess if I could like sort of conclude on all of this with like one general thought, or like one more question that I would pose to him, or like ask more about, is okay. So civil society needs to change. Like that's where like we should be looking towards, not towards like formal politics. And again, like I agree. I just can't. Maybe it's a lack of imagination on my part. But like I just don't know how that changes without broad coalitions and like party building. Like I don't know, please listeners, I don't know why, but like for some reason for some reasons it seems like like party structures or something like that is important for leftist politics and for Christianity. I don't know.
Matt, you're like so close to just converting to Catholicism. I don't know why you don't just do it. Right.
Because they don't ordain women. What's up? Yeah, that's it. That's the only reason.
Rap air horns.
Yeah, rap air horns. Rap Gregorian chant.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like that type of social organization, that type of discipline, that type of like, I don't know, like loose cohesion is good. Sort of like mobilizing people to do a thing is good. And I don't know. I just don't see how that civil society changes without a modicum of coalitions, a modicum of discipline, a bit of doing things.
I agree. It's also just, I don't know. It's tough. Well, we ran into the same problem with Virilio, but we didn't really flag it as much in the last episode. But so Virilio gets this kind of inspiration from, you know, I don't know, talking to regular old people. But it's like regular old people are not, you know, well, Goldman Sachs doesn't care about your chicken coop, but it also does not care about street people at all. They're like on purpose.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree. Like, there's got to be some kind of way of organizing regular old people into a kind of mass that makes demands. Like, I was struck by this really interesting interview with Boots Riley, the frontman of the communist rap group, The Coup.
Yeah.
And he made this comment about how, like, you know, in the beginning of sort of these massive American workers' movements, when you demonstrated, the reason they called it a demonstration is that you were like demonstrating a show of force. It's basically like, listen, there's a lot more of us than there are of you. You better work this out or like you're going to get screwed.
Yeah.
And that's not really the case anymore. And I think there's something to that. And that's not just civil society per se, or at least if it is, it's like very organized. And it has to be organized by real organizations, you know, whether those are unions or parties or whatever. Yeah, I agree. It's something that I wish Lambert talked more about, or something that I guess I would have asked more about. It's really not his fault. I shouldn't blame him, but yeah, it's a unresolved problem.
Yeah. I mean, he mentions protests, and I think that's part of it. You know, there's I mentioned my MA advisor earlier in this podcast, Richard Gilman-Opolsky. He writes like exclusively about revolutionary theory, and he's very good, I think, on this topic about parties, and maybe like a helpful corrective to like my like, I don't know, overzealousness to like just get organized and do something. But he has this take in his newest book where he says like, you know, Jody Dean people, they want like parties and like whatever. But the difficulty is that like people protesting apparently don't want them because they don't organize into them.
Right.
And I don't know. I guess that's true too. The people that Paul Virilio is talking about, meeting on the street, everyday people. I don't know. They aren't organizing yet, and maybe I don't know. Maybe it's not desirable for people. Maybe like they really don't want that. Maybe it's just like me as like a privileged academic or something that thinks that's like the way to do things, but. I don't know.
The societal evil is too much.
Yeah, it seems like it. It seems like that's just like the thing to do.
Yeah, I know. I feel very caught between these two impulses. On the one hand, so like Lambert really internalizes the motivations of someone like Adorno and Horkheimer that he studied for so long, where they're basically like, listen, this is not going to happen. Sorry. I guess we'll keep thinking about it. We'll keep critiquing it. But he doesn't have the same depressive mood. But at the same time, I guess, I don't know, I'm a little too, like, misanthropic to, like, feel like average people will figure it out. And that's where I feel like party movements are good. That's also why I think, like, I don't know, having bishops can be good. Like, some people are just not going to figure it out. And it can be helpful, even though it's dangerous to have those kinds of disciplinary organizations. But, at the same time, like, I don't know, I want women priests too, but like my bishop says no, so I don't really know what to do with that.
Yeah, man. Well, okay, so we don't know. That's okay.
Yeah, well, anyway, we should take this opportunity to thank Lambert for doing this. It was pretty funny. I mean, basically, I just emailed him and I was like, hey, you're going to be in town. Want to be on this podcast? And he was like, sure. I don't really like know how that works. So kudos to him for being like a really great sport and giving us this audio. And also, we'll make the audio in full, like the interview that I did from beginning to end. We'll make that all available without our edits and link it in the show notes and stuff. So you can just listen to it. He says a lot more about a lot of other things. Like he talks about post-truth politics. I really wish we would have had a chance to get into that. But and a lot of other stuff. He talks more about his own experience and like, organizing a cooperative to, like, screw the landlords in Alberta. That's, like, a very cool story. Anyway, listen to that. But, like, thanks, Lambert. That was really awesome of you to do.
Yeah, for sure. All right, thanks for listening to the Magnificast. Make sure you check out our blog, themagnificast.wordpress.com, and you can read about the upcoming summer reading group, or just, like, check out our Patreon account, and you can get signed up there. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. Give us a review on iTunes. Tell your friends. Tell your mom. Tell your boss. Just kidding. Don't do that. Organize against him. And cool. See you guys next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up.